Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this peace panel in celebration of the Geneva Peace Week. I am Mélanie Régimbal, and I am the Chief of Service of the Office for Disarmament Affairs of the United Nations, based here in Geneva, and it is my great pleasure to moderate this panel on what is the future of small arms control. This panel is organized in collaboration with the Small Arms Survey, the Swiss Federal Department for Foreign Affairs, as well as the Center on Conflict Development and Peace Building. And of course, we are delighted to be here always in partnership with our colleagues from the Geneva Graduate Institute. So today we have an exciting panel for all of you with great speakers and surprise video interventions. And we are delighted to have you join us here in the room in Geneva, but also from across the world online through the magic of virtuality. For those of you who are in the room and also online, a few housekeeping issues. We do have live interpretation, so for those of you who are in the room, you can download the QR codes. There were flyers that were passed around at the beginning of the session, and you also have them somewhere along the walls where you can have direct interpretation into several languages. And the same is true electronically. I believe you can have access to interpretation. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the panel, and we will welcome questions from the room, but also from our colleagues online. And here my colleagues from the Small Arms Survey will help me filter the questions and ensure that those that are posing the questions online can be also included in this section. So, to get us started, I am absolutely delighted to welcome two of our colleagues who will be delivering the opening remarks and introducing a little bit this panel and understanding where we are on the future of small arms. And so without further ado, I'm very pleased to give the floor to Monsieur Gilles Cerruti, who is the head of the Peace and Human Rights Division of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, Switzerland. And Switzerland, of course, has a very long tradition of supporting these human-centered disarmament approaches and understanding the harmony and links between small arms, peace, development, and human rights. Mr. Cerruti, you have the floor.
Is it working now? Great. Thank you very much, Melanie. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I'm very pleased to be in front of you. As you may know, Switzerland is a strong supporter of both the Geneva Peace Week, but also the partners that are organizing these events today. First and foremost, the Small Arms Survey and the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs. So thank you for that. And we're also very happy to see that today is a moment where the two communities meet, the peace community and the small arms community. Thank you also to Mark from the Small Arms Survey for the invitation to take part to today's event. I'll focus my remarks to two main points. The first one is on the fact that I think that this event really is an opportunity to bridge the gap that sometimes exists between the peace community and the small arms community. The small arms topic is sometimes seen as a technical one. It is often addressed by small arms specialists, and it's sometimes difficult to have a wider conversation with experts from the peace sector, human rights sector, or the development sector around the table. However, the links between those two issues are quite evident, and it's a two-way relationship. On the one hand, it's obvious that the presence of small arms or the proliferation of small arms fuels conflicts. This is a little bit in economical terms the supply side of the equation, and on the other hand, conflicts call for the trafficking of small arms. It's from the economic perspective, it would be the demand side of the equation, and it's a vicious cycle that needs to be broken. Because the illicit proliferation of small arms does have a massive impact on peace and human security. It destabilizes regions, it fuels and it prolongs conflicts, criminality, terrorism. it undermines peace processes, and it hinders development. So we really think that there's value and there's merit for those who work for peace to benefit, for peace building to benefit from the expertise and the work of the small arms community. But the reverse is also true. Where there is sustainable peace, where people feel safe, then there is less demand for small arms, and there will be less illicit proliferation. So that's why it's really important for us to break a little bit this silo that exists sometimes between the two communities and try to see how we can bridge that gap. And I think this event can contribute to exactly that. Just an additional point on this initial remark, we think today is really a good moment to focus more on this kind of joint approach, and it's also in the spirit of the time. If for those of you who have looked into the Pact of the Future that was recently adopted in New York, small arms control is identified as a measure to build sustainable peace. So that's also an entry point that we can use to work on that. And that's something that Switzerland has been focusing on quite a lot over the last years. I can just mention two examples here today. For example, we fund the Salient initiative, which is led by ODA, which is basically a fund that has a pool fund that has a holistic approach to arms control and to sustainable development and peace. And another example that I can mention is a Swiss initiative with various partners that we have launched last year in West Africa, where we have organized regional dialogues with actors, specialized actors and states from the region to address exactly that, the link between prevention, peace, and weapons and ammunition management. And the conversation that took place, it was in Lomé in Togo, was really rich, really interesting, and the experts from both communities were really finding value in having that conversation, and it will lead to follow-ups, exchange of good practices, and possibly also guidelines at the level of the regional organization, the ECOWAS. So it's a track that Switzerland really wants to continue working on, bridging the gap between those two things. This brings me to my second remark, which is shorter, and which is really also on the topic of today's panel. It's the future of small arms. So where do we go now? And we think we are at the junction today, and I think that's what the panelists will focus on. On the one hand, the small arms agenda is almost 25 years old. I think that's the point that the first panelist, Keith, will be discussing. And the fact that it's still on the agenda today is a measure of its success and its relevance. However, keeping the momentum 25 years after the inception of this agenda is sometimes difficult. And as we see today in the news, the biggest conflicts that are in the news today, the attention is mainly focused on heavy weapons and also sometimes the nuclear threat. However, the small arms control is as needed today as ever. We see in many regions that this is really the weapons that kills most people and that really fuels conflicts. And we see also that the number of victims of small arms today is about 700 people a day. So the relevance is absolutely there, and I think that's also what the second panelist will be delving upon. The question today is how do we move forward? How do we keep or reignite further this momentum? How do we keep having an impact? And I'm really much looking to the third panelist, who I think will address that point, and also to the discussion that we'll have afterwards, and looking forward to hearing your questions and ideas in how we can keep that momentum for small arms and for this link between small arms and peace. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Cerruti. It's a pleasure to have you always with us here today. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Mark Downs, who is the director of the Small Arms Survey and has been fulfilling this role since February this year. Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much. And friends and colleagues, let me join Melanie and Gilles in welcoming you to this panel discussion on the 11th Geneva Peace Week. And today's panel will obviously ask the question, what is the future for small arms control? And so we look back on the evolution of the agenda, but we'll also want to look forward on what are the key challenges facing the agenda, facing our communities, and facing the world today. This month also marks the 25th anniversary of the Small Arms Survey, and so I'm really delighted that we're able to have the survey's founder, Professor Keith Krauser, here on the panel today. And in many ways, the evolution of the survey itself has mirrored the evolution of the small arms control agenda. And our focus has always been to support these developments and to also try to foresee trends and challenges and to be able to provide credible data and field-level experience to be able to influence policy. As Gilles mentioned, the relevance of the small arms control agenda remains today as relevant as it did 25 years ago. And the latest figures from our Global Violent Deaths database indicate that in 2021, over 500,000 people died violently, of which 260,000 were killed with a firearm. And early indications from the situation in subsequent years has obviously indicated that this figure will increase. And this marks a significant reversal from the positive trends that we had seen since 2016. Moreover, and my colleague Anne Severine will talk to this in her intervention, our recent work in the Caribbean has indicated the cost and impact of armed violence. The average cost of treating a single gunshot wound is as high as between 2 and 11 times the GDP spending per capita on health. And this underlines the link between armed violence and development, as well as the fact that in many regions, the illicit proliferation of small arms and light weapons is not only an arms control issue or a security issue, it's a public health and a human rights issue. So as we celebrate the 25th anniversary of the survey, we remain committed to working with partners bilaterally and through international instruments such as the UN Programme of Action, ITI, the ATT, and the Global Ammunition Framework to contribute to tackling the issue of the illicit proliferation of small arms and light weapons and to minimizing the impact of armed violence. So as part of today's discussion, let me maybe highlight 4 or 5 key lessons that we've been able to identify. The first of which, and it was mentioned already by Gilles, is that efforts to address the illicit trade in small arms needs to look at both supply but also demand factors. Unless we address why people are trying to acquire illicit weapons, efforts to address illicit supply routes will have limited impact. And so to achieve sustainable change in arms control, it's essential that we prioritize our coherent, cohesive approach to addressing the root causes of conflict and armed violence. The second is that we need to move beyond the small arms control community. Arms control efforts require a whole of government, but also a whole of society approach. Inclusive national strategies to implement what are international legal or political agreements need to be coherent with wider development strategies. And they need to be developed in partnership with communities, with academia, with CSO, and the private sector as well. The third point we'd make is that the inclusion of provisions on gender-responsive small arms control is key. Armed violence is a gendered phenomenon. Developing solutions requires strengthening efforts to collect gender disaggregated data, to measure the differential impacts of small arms, to incorporating gender perspectives in all policies and programs that draw on evidence and good practice, and to support the meaningful participation of diverse groups, women and men, in all aspects of small arms control. One theme that I've heard consistently this week is the need to focus at the local level. And this is as important in small arms control as it is in any peace or security initiatives. Leveraging regional roadmaps to support national and community level initiatives is key. However, in this area of small arms proliferation, we need to recognize that it's also a transnational challenge. And so ensuring good exchange of information and coordinated responses at a regional and international level is vital. The final point I'd make is that we need to invest in identifying new and evolving threats and challenges, and this includes the challenge posed by privately made and other non-industrial small arms, as well as improvised weapons, ammunition, and explosives. These collectively now represent an increasing size of seized weapons in all contexts and all regions. And in many ways, the international frameworks that govern small arms control have failed to keep pace with technological developments. Privately manufactured weapons, which include 3D printed weapons and components, as well as improvised weapons such as drones and IEDs, now represent a very significant proportion of all seizures and are increasingly difficult to trace. The international policy and international guidance needs to keep pace with this technological change, and collectively we all have a key role to play in this. So these are just some of the challenges that define the small arms control agenda today. The challenges are immense. We need to redouble our efforts. We need a new generation of researchers, advocates, and practitioners to take forward this work. And we need to integrate innovative ideas and solutions to ensure that data drives better policy making, and that policy is focused on those most affected by the illicit proliferation of small arms and live weapons. And it's events such as these, hopefully, that will allow us to bring forward these new and innovative ideas as well. So with that, thank you, and back to Melanie.
Thank you so much, Mark, for those words, and to both you, Mr. Downs and Mr. Sorutu, for that comprehensive introduction and for reminding us the synergies that already exist amongst all of the multilateral instruments that we have. And I'm delighted that our panelists today will take us through a little bit of that history of where we're coming from, where we are, and what are the tools that we have to get to the future, and to do so at a multiple layered level, from the national to the regional to the or community, national, regional, and international, and how important that is. And for also bringing to the forefront, as I introduce our panelists, the opportunity that we now have with the Pact of the Future that tries specifically to do that, to merge and bring together all of these instruments, be the newest instruments such as the Global Ammunition Framework, or the older instruments that we have that are still very mighty in their ability, such as the Program of Action on Small Arms, and also understanding how this ties into the Arms Trade Treaty, and a whole slew of tools that we have that are absolutely fundamental to allowing us to get to the objectives of the Pact of the Future, which is to reduce the human cost of weapons, to be able to focus our efforts on empowering those instruments with a view not only to protecting civilians, but also to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that that is at the core of what we will be hearing today. So I have the great pleasure of introducing our three panelists. I will introduce them first all together and then give them the floor individually. But I'm delighted to have with us Keith Krause, who is, of course, very well known to the small arms community and has been a professor of international relations at the Graduate Institute since 1994, is currently the director of the Center on Conflict and Development and Peacebuilding, a partner in the organization of this event, and was, of course, from 2000 to 2016, the program director of the Small Arms Survey. So we're delighted to have you with us, Keith, for this event. We will also hear from Anne-Séverine Fabre, who is a longstanding researcher with the Small Arms Survey, who has led a lot of projects on West Africa and the Caribbean region. She will be able to talk to us a little bit about illicit arms trafficking and looking at the wider stakeholders that need to be involved in our work to ensure that our current work takes us and ensures a brighter future, whereas Keith will have focused more on where we're coming from, where we are, and where we need to be, and understanding who are the actors that have mobilized us to where we are. And then finally, we will hear from Ms. Victoria Voronina, who is the executive director of the Center for Security Studies and is currently based in Ukraine. She has been working with the International Cooperation and Coordination direction of the State Agency of the Ukraine for the Donbass Recovery in the Ministry for the Temporarily Occupied Territories and IDPs of Ukraine. And so she will bring to us very local and community-based perspectives of how small arms can be addressed and where we are going with these issues. So without further ado, I give the floor to Dr. Krause, who will start us off and remind us a little bit of where we're coming from and where we need to go.
Thank you, Melanie, for that. The good news about this audience is that there are so many faces that are unfamiliar to me, which I think is an important sign for future work in this area. I have, as people have noted, been doing this for some time. I'm only going to spend 1 minute on the past, which is to say we live in a completely different world than when the UN Program of Action and various instruments were negotiated in the early 2000s. It's difficult, if not impossible, to imagine getting that sort of agreement, even just politically binding, today. And in fact, probably we would get nothing at all or something that was much, much weaker. It built on momentum from the landmine ban treaty. It built on the efforts of states such as Colombia and Costa Rica, which had been pushing the small arms issue on the agenda for quite some time in the 1990s as the last frontier of arms control and disarmament. And more importantly, it built upon a very wide coalition of civil society actors and activists that highlighted the impact of the wars of the 1990s, whether they're in the Democratic Republic of Congo, former Yugoslavia, or elsewhere, on the civilian population and the aftermath that small arms proliferation had even when the formal fighting had stopped. All of this came together to slowly move some states towards seeking solutions to the problems of small arms and light weapons, and most of it was framed through either a human security or a humanitarian disarmament perspective. And here I should underline the importance of a coalition of the willing, which included Switzerland, Norway, Canada, the UK, and others, some of whom were working under the Human Security Network, but all of whom found very creative ways to build a coalition to push this forward both at the multilateral UN level and elsewhere. And I think that's an important lesson for the future, too. Not everything will be done at the global multilateral level, but through coalitions of the willing. The language of human security and humanitarian disarmament, it's still present, but it's pretty much drowned out, right, by the language of defense and deterrence and geopolitical confrontation and war. I'm not going to go through the details. I think we're all well aware of the bad news. The good news is that we do have some imperfect but useful instruments, some of which are formal and have been mentioned, such as the UN Program of Action itself and its regular meetings, the International Tracing Instrument, the Arms Trade Treaty, we'll hear a bit about that, initiatives for ammunition management, enhancing national legislation, securing weapons stockpiles, and so forth. Most of these can be pursued by individual states or regionally, or sub-regionally, or bilaterally, or in a coalition. So we have an array of tools to chip away at the challenges, even when the multilateral system, and this is an unpopular thing to say in Geneva, is on life support. And I think we need to recognize that. So how can we be creative? Mark said we should work locally. I would say let's work really locally. There are many initiatives that can be pursued in urban settings through such things as armed violence observatories that bring together the stakeholders who work from a criminological, public health, small arms, peace and development perspective to address very local challenges in urban settings. And I think that's an area where people could pay much more attention. My final kind of collective reflection here is that much of the success of the survey and of the work of the early people who came to the small arms issue 25 years ago was based on a recognition that collectively we didn't know much at all about the scope, scale, and contours of the problem. We didn't know how many people were directly and indirectly affected by armed violence. We didn't have estimates of the global burden in terms of deaths and injuries. We didn't know where the guns were, in whose hands, where they were coming from, how they were circulating from legal possession to illegal and illicit actors. We didn't know whether the problem was supply or demand driven or both. We didn't know what happened to weapons that were taken out of circulation after conflict. In some cases, in the early 2000s or 1990s, when the police seized weapons, they would later resell them legally in places such as South Africa, because after all, it was a way to add to the police budget. That practice has stopped, in part because of the work that many people did at a national level. And there was an opening in the early 2000s for evidence-based policies and to seek answers to these questions. I would say that now we actually do have the knowledge base. And more importantly, and I think this is a point that Gilles made, for at least the Small Arms Survey, it was never just about the guns. those are one part of a much broader picture or tapestry, and you need to situate every initiative to deal with small arms within the broader understanding of armed violence prevention and reduction, including the demand factors that people are talking about, but also not just the instruments, but the institutions and the legal frameworks that enable or reduce the risk of violence, the motivations that people have, not just for possessing weapons, but actually misusing the weapons, because there is a large legal market and legal possession of that. But why is it, what brings people to use them in certain circumstances, and how can that be addressed? We have the knowledge base. We're not exactly in a world in which evidence-based policymaking is a popular idea in all quarters, although I think most of us here would remain committed to that. But what this means is that we have to be extremely tactical, very politically savvy, and quite creative for looking for opportunities, because the evidence themselves, or evidence itself, whether it's the number of deaths, the cost of violence in the Caribbean and elsewhere, the vast increases in the circulation of weapons itself, the evidence is not going to bring about change. So you have to think very creatively about where the opportunities are, however small, to reduce the global burden of armed violence. My closing comment, because I was reminded of this when Gilles spoke, was that when the survey was started and various governments, including Switzerland, came on board to support it, we would say, well, this is a problem that's going to take 20 to 30 years to address. I think we might have been off by a couple of decades, but progress is being made, however small and however invisible at the global level, but certainly it is visible at the regional, sub-regional, national, and sometimes even local level, and that gives me at least some optimism for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kraus, for that. Building on your remarks and the introduction that we had from our colleagues, how can we mobilize or make use of the new tools that we have, be it the new Agenda for Peace, the global framework on ammunition, of course, the Pact of the Future that was just signed or agreed to, adopted last September. How can we mobilize these instruments to also mobilize this community of the willing to use these instruments as a springboard to revive and take off life support this very, very key process, rather than having these processes bring us down further, because we know that states are strapped for resources. There are so many instruments out there. How do we use this as an opportunity to take us forward and not keep us treading water in place?
I think I would highlight two things, one of which is in the Pact for the Future and elsewhere, and that is a focus on prevention. It is not just a focus on conflict prevention, and it is definitely not just a focus at the global level. It's meant to actually spur action to develop national prevention strategies, which I think can be very clearly put in the framework of violence prevention and reduction. And we know some things about that. There have been studies done, most notably through the OECD and its International Network on Conflict and Fragility, that brought the armed violence reduction agenda to the development community. And so I think that we can hook into this impetus for national level prevention strategies that, again, do not require multilateral agreements to move forward. The second, of course, there is mention of the small arms issue itself in the actions in the Pact for the Future. I don't know how much momentum that will create. And then finally, we do have SDG 16, which was a big victory, not just for the small arms community, but the armed violence community and the fusion of issues of peace and arms proliferation and its headline goals and targets. And I think that this is always going to be the hardest goal to achieve, but it's also one that's crucial to the achievement of many of the other goals. And so if we don't kind of push that agenda forward, and I have to say it's not going very fast, we're not going to make progress on the entire Sustainable Development Goals agenda. So I would focus on at least the prevention side and perhaps SDG 16.
Thank you so much for that, and I think that leads us very neatly into not only our following speaker, to whom I will give the floor in a few minutes, but not before the ability to showcase one of the videos that we have from our colleagues that are joining us virtually. I believe the first video will feature our colleague, Ms. Karina Solmirano, who is a longtime advocate and has been part of this global community of warriors trying to make this place a better place and to understand what the human costs of small arms are. And she will talk to us both on how the small arms issues fit into the wider panorama, including the Arms Trade Treaty. So I would ask our colleagues at the IT to work their magic.
Hello everyone, I'm Karina Solmirano, I'm from Argentina, and I have been working in the field of arms control and disarmament for, I think, the past 20 years. In the most recent years, in the last 5 years I would say, I have been working exclusively on issues related to the Arms Trade Treaty. The Arms Trade Treaty is the first international instrument that regulates the conventional trade in conventional arms and in small arms and light weapons. From the early days in which this treaty was negotiated, there was a big impetus and participation from civil society. This started many years ago with only 3 governments highlighting the harm that the proliferation of small arms and light weapons was making in the world. The text of the treaty was adopted by the General Assembly by an overwhelming majority of states, and in 2014, at the end, in December of 2014, it entered into force. This treaty, through the negotiations, included a very valuable humanitarian goal, which is the treaty also seeks to reduce human suffering. Today, the ATT family has about 115 state parties. Looking into the next decade of the treaty, I think a lot of the stakeholders want to start having real conversations about what it means, this treaty, in real life. When you look into whether there have been any new measures to control the import or export of their weapons, they are struggling with this, especially nations in the global south or in developing countries. So I think those are the ones that need to be targeted for assistance, for support, for outreach. Sometimes these instruments also set up provisions that involve a lot of work for states. And so there is a momentum in which a new state joins a treaty, and there is like this really positive approach to trying to implement everything. And then the willingness to do it sort of, decreases. And we have seen, especially in instruments where you have to do some sort of reporting. One thing interesting that I would like to see in the future also is how we include the new global framework on ammunition in this conversation. Because at the end of the day, a lot of people say, without the ammunition, the weapon, it doesn't have any purpose. Maybe in the future also see, are there any synergies, with the new discussions on autonomous weapons? Having real discussions about gender-based violence and violence against children, and how, the irresponsible trade of these weapons might have an impact on these two issues is going to be extremely relevant. I think that there is an opportunity to also see how other treaties are including other stakeholders. When I mentioned that the ATT, for instance, includes, civil society, but I know that other instruments, they have brought victims, right? The victims are also part of, the conversations. And at the end of the day, I think, the inclusivity of these communities are the ones that are going to make the difference, in terms of promoting that peace and stability that each treaty seeks to do.
Thank you, Karina, for joining us virtually on this effect, and for also reminding us the synergies between the small arms issues and the Arms Trade Treaty, and on Dr. Krause's last point on the importance of trying to move forward not only with the Pact of the Future, but also with the very key implementation of the Sustainable Development Goal. I believe that our next speaker, Ms. Anne-Séverine Fabre, will be able to shed some light on some of the key stakeholders that we need to engage with at the regional and national level so that we can bring these goals to the forefront and really try to achieve in a timely manner the Sustainable Development Goal as well as the implementation of these key instruments. Anne-Séverine, you have the floor.
Thank you, Melanie. Good morning, everyone. So next slide, please. I'll start by giving you the most recent figures we have on the state of our violence. And as you can see on the slide, more than 500,000 people died in 2021. This figure is going upward compared to 2020. And with emerging conflicts or accentuation of existing conflicts in the last 3 years, war in Gaza, Ukraine, DRC, Sudan, just to name a few, future figures might tend towards the same direction, as was mentioned by Mark. Out of these global violent death figures, 15% of the victims were women, a quarter relate to conflict death, and 2/3 to homicides, including close to half committed by a firearm. Another key figure is 1 billion. This is the estimate of licit and illicit firearms owned worldwide, most of which are in the hands of civilians. So let's put these figures into perspective now. We have homicides worldwide that amount to the majority of violent death and for which a significant amount is committed by firearm. And then we have the vast majority of firearms in the hands of individuals. This shows the need to strengthen and monitor rules and regulations to prevent the diversion of legal weapons to the illicit sphere and to enhance the detection, tracing, and interdicting of small arms trafficking, but also to understand and tackle the demand, as it was multiple times earlier by previous panelists mentioned. And then these needs are challenged with the advancement of technology. You have new techniques and creative ways that influence as well the production of small arms parts or components and other related items, like was also mentioned by Mark. So it becomes harder to prevent, detect, trace, and interdict those types of items. Because, for example, you have no serial number or user markings. You have legal loopholes to impede the production steps. And sometimes you also have the lack of training to recognize and investigate these items. You can see a few examples on the screen: converted firearms, improvised explosive devices, lethal autonomous weapons, non-industrial small arms, such as gas guns and 3D printed firearms. Some of these items have been used in conflict zones. Others are recovered in crime scene or seized by law enforcement. For example, let's take conversion device as an example. Those are small, ready-to-install parts to turn a semi-automatic firearm into a fully automatic one. You have the picture here, the red item. They have been seized multiple times in the US, South America, and Europe. And they are making also their way south in the Caribbean with the first seizures in 2020. And experts are wondering now if these devices are rendering shootings deadlier. On the screen, you see the conversion device that was sold as a coat hanger. So it gives you an idea of the issue of detecting these new items. Next slide, please. With these past and newer challenges posed by small arms and violence, you see that there's a need also to approach small arms control in a multi-sectorial way. This is not only a matter of security and defense sector to counter small arms trafficking and violence, but also of health, education, and other development sectors. So like it was mentioned previously, we need to integrate other actors. This is not a new call, because isn't it what the SDGs aim at? But times are showing that this is more than ever important. And in the Caribbean, for example, You have the heads of governments that have declared crime and violence as a public health issue last year in 2023. And they have highlighted a series of measures, including the need for an all-of-society strategy. So we are also currently at the Small Arms Survey conducting a project, Pathway to Policy, on integrating security and public health response to firearms trafficking and violence in the Caribbean. And to do so, we have partnered with regional institutions working in security, public health, and academia. You see CARICOM Impact, CARFA, and the GACDRC. And we also previously worked with them on the Caribbean Firearms Study, and we found that the rate of homicide in the Caribbean is 3 times higher than the global rate. And more than half of these homicides are committed by firearm. In some of these countries, it goes up to 90%. Just to give you an example, with Jamaica, 1,508 homicides committed in 2022, with about 85% committed with a firearm. So this gives you about a rate of more than 50 homicides per 100,000 populations. To put this number into perspective, in Switzerland, we are about 0.5 to 0.6 homicides per 100,000 populations. And the population of Switzerland, like about 9 million. In Jamaica, 2.8. Just to put those numbers into perspective. And our research also showed that the gun violence that is triggered a heavy burden on society as a whole. You have, like was also mentioned by Mark, the cost to treat a gunshot wound that exceed by far the health spending per capita. You have also the need for urgent care for those patients that paralyzed the hospitals, especially after a shooting with multiple victims. And you have also more recently a number of shootings directly in hospitals. So the Caribbean, there have been recorded also gang members coming to finish the job directly at the hospitals when the victim did not die. So all of these challenges highlight that not only security and defense actors have a role in small arms control, but also public health and other actors who are all impacted by the phenomenon. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Séverine, for that very eye-opening reality check as to where we are and the importance of including all of these stakeholders in our work on these issues. My question to you would be, how can we today in 2024 ensure that these stakeholders, this great variety of stakeholders, whether we're looking at the new and emerging technologies that is involved further and further in illicit trafficking, or the involvement of the public health sector, how can we move them from more of a preventive or responsive role into more of a preventive role? And how can we, as a community here in Geneva, help mobilize that and help states ensure that these new stakeholders form part of not only the responsive part, but also the preventive elements?
I think it's first by also inviting these stakeholders into the table when these discussions are happening. For example, when events like this are happening, also trying to reach out to these different sectors. Then I would mention also highlighting the synergies between the different sectors and how they can complement each other work into that aspect. And this would be, for example, by making sure that each of these sectors also understand how they are impacted by the phenomenon and also understand what are the added value, what they can bring to the table. Because also often you see, and you see also that also in the security and defense sectors, there's a lot of work that is done in silos. And so often they don't they don't communicate, there's a lack of cooperation. Like we often talk about international cooperation, but also at the national level, sometimes there's often lack of coordination, lack of cooperation in between the different departments. So not being aware also of what the other departments are doing, or not being aware of where they could complement the work is not helping on the prevention side.
Thank you so much for that answer, Anne-Séverine. And I think as you've contextualized the issue, it fits very well. And I think that the efforts that are happening globally in different regions, particularly as they pertain to the global firearms roadmaps that we have seen pop up in different regions, allow these states to not only put in place national measures, but also regional frameworks where we are able precisely to involve a wider range of stakeholders. And I think that that's absolutely wonderful and is also very relevant for our next speaker, who will bring us down to even one lower level, which is at the community level, and understanding how all of these frameworks actually come into action at the very, very basic community level. And for that, I am delighted to invite Ms. Victoria Voronina to share with us the experience of how things are happening in Ukraine and understanding the link between all of these global instruments and how they are actually implemented and applied at the community level. Victoria, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Actually, I would like to start with some overview of situation in Ukraine, of statistics. We know that we had almost 3 years of wild-scale operation in Ukraine, and we all understand that the number of seized firearms will be increased, and now it's increasing. You see on my slide some figures like more than 4,000 facts of illegal handling of weapons, ammunition, and explosives were registered in 2023. And these crimes were conducted by more than 3,000 of people. So it's only official statistic. We also have a different type of small arms and light weapons that seized during 2023. It's not only about guns or pistols, it's also about assault rifles. For example, you can see here that more than 1,000 assault rifles were seized. It's about converted weapons. It's about cartridges. Almost 2 million cartridges were seized. 16,000 mines, 17,000 grenades. So we see these numbers, and it's only official data. When we talk to police officers and when we speak to national police representatives and leaderships, they started to talk about not only countering of small arms and light weapons, but always a situation of control and the situation of culture, how to deal with this problem and how to raise the awareness of people about the risk of illegal arms use, illegal arms trafficking, and other very crucial issues. Since 2022, we have different situation in this area, and we some trends actually say it, but we have almost a lot of new trends. For example, if we are talking about illegal drugs trafficking and use, almost every time, in majority of cases, when it is a crime with drugs, there are some weapons, some pistols, grenades, cartridges could be found in these places with drugs. Now women are involving more and more in different crimes. And for example, when is the issue of drugs, so from time to time, we can see the presence of pistols or grenades in women bags, for example, in some suitcase. If you're talking about arms trafficking, now we have different typical categories of offenders. For example, rifles or grenade launchers could be found in priest houses, in village elders. Women could be owners of illegal arms like launchers or pistols. Soldiers, of course, because we have the war, and volunteers. It's increasing the number of raider attacks and debt extortion with using of guns or rifles. Also, we understand that illegal possession or use of arms by our military personnel. We still have some representatives that collaborate with Russian security forces and armed forces, and they have like a storages of weapons, especially on occupied territories, including some grenade launchers, including cartridges, including rifles. Now we have the situation, a very dangerous situation with children that are at risk because the grenade could be found on playgrounds, in kindergarten, in different premises. For example, one of Russian collaborators saved rifles and launchers under the child bed in his house. So you can see how risky is the situation for ordinary civilians, and especially for children who know nothing about how to deal with gun when he or she could find this pistol or grenade in the playground. We also have different unusual places for arms storages, at job places, at some railway station. Actually, we have this situation of risk with service sector. For example, in cafes, in pension fund services, in public administration services offices, in banks, in postal offices. From time to time, people with some post-trauma stress disorder can come there, ask for some services, could not receive appropriate replies or services from administrators or operators, and they could show the gun or they could show the grenade to this administrator, and people do not understand how to react on it. What could be the danger? What risk can make this illegal use or this showing of rifle or gun or grenade to the service provider? Also, we have some trends that was like a previous one, the transportation of arms in car or in other vehicles. And of course, we have the problem of Russian trophies and caches. So when we have the situation battlefield, like changing situation from occupation to occupation, from time to time, it could be the situation with Russian trophies and with these caches. Actually, we see a lot of risks in this situation because we monitor it from 2019 during all these 5 years, and we see the trends, how it could change the situation even in community level, and what risk could be on community level that not only covered by countering from police side, from national police or other law enforcement agency. It also could be the situation that need engagement of different stakeholders, wider circles of stakeholders, for example, community leaders, so local self-government bodies, other ministries, other governmental institutions like the Ministry of Culture, for example, or other ministries that could engage or Ministry of Education that could be engaged in knowledge awareness about all this risk and about all this dangerous situation. Risk for community security, risks of political violence, risk of business climate, because this business environment is seen on community level, business work on community level in majority of cases, and how the businessmen open a new facility with understanding that this is a risky territory, or it could be security danger for community security, for example. It could be strengthening of organized crimes group or increasing the number of such groups, or increasing the level of violence during conducting the crimes. Actually, it's a change in culture of disputes or conflict resolution when people can show the rifle or grenade and could win in this dispute. It could be risk of change the nature of internal or external terrorism. And also one of the risks for us is EU association process, because according to Article 12 of EU association agreement, Ukraine could do some list of obligations on non-proliferation on small arms and light weapons. And of course, we have several categories of in our society that could be vulnerable of illegal using or illegal possession of and trafficking of arms. We have such hypothesis that not only law enforcement agencies should be involved in this process, and we went to communities and we asked community leaders, local self-government bodies, what they think about the situation with small arms and light weapons widespread throughout the Ukraine and especially in their community. What they think about legalization, what they think about collection or seizing these illegal arms after the war or during the war. And we saw that actually in Ukraine, by the way, the methodology, yes. We used this following methodology. We went to 5 regions. We selected different communities from east, west, center of Ukraine with different environment connected to the war in Ukraine. For example, closeness to the battle zone or closeness to the western border. Some information about military personnel that could be located in this community or veterans. It could be community like cities, not villages. So we used the approach of typical community in Ukraine and went to this community and checked the situation, what they think about risks and how they are aware about such risks connected with small arms and light weapons. And in the usual, in each state, our local government bodies actually more oriented on their legal mandate and bureaucracy. And they see their responsibility mostly on police officers or other law enforcement agencies or security sector agencies, authorities. They do not understand properly mid-term and long-term threats like the security issues, radicalization, political pressure, different violence, business environment, etc. They prefer to cooperate with our security sector only on in official manner. Only if we have something like extraordinary, they receive information from police officers or from other agencies on operational level, like with calls, etc. So they do not implement any activities that could be put before in their local programs of cooperation with law enforcement. For example, in Ukraine, it's a very common situation that each community has a program, local program of cooperation with law enforcement agencies, especially with police. But nothing of such, no such programs actually include the activities on countering illegal small arms and light weapons, but we have the 3 years of war already, and before this we have the war in Donbass. They do not know a lot about voluntary surrender of weapons, and these voluntary surrender programs do not work properly during the war. We have a good mechanism of checkpoint, for example, in entry and exit of communities. It was established a checkpoint that could, in these checkpoints, officers could check the situation and check the cars, vehicles, can check different people who cross the community border. And it's work very good, but still need additional equipment because it's very difficult to identify pieces of guns, pieces of rifles inside the car, for example, or other vehicle. Actually, we have some problems with protocol of carrying or storing firearms by military personnel because from time to time they need to leave it in their units or some premises, but they not always do it actually. And the threat of illicit small arms and light weapons more visible for communities close to the conflict zone. And when we ask our community leaders, what should we do with small arms and light weapons after the war or during the war? Should we legalize it? Should we identify different categories of people that could be the owners of I don't know, pistols or other types of weapons? And the communities close to the battle zone saw all these risks, and they say, so no, we should recollect, we should seize all arms and no legalization for no categories, only law enforcement. But if we move to the center of Ukraine or to the western part of Ukraine, people there want to have guns, pistols, rifles, to secure their households, to secure their family. And they provide us example of the strategy of Irpin and Bucha, where people were without arms and they cannot secure themselves, they cannot defend themselves. That's why it's not the same situation in the western part, in the eastern part of Ukraine, and in the central part of Ukraine. Actually, my main point is we need to understand the situation with illegal arms use and arms control, not only from the perspective of law enforcement agency or only security sector. We should also include as much stakeholders in this process as possible, because it would cover a lot of other areas like business or economy, like culture, like health, education, etc. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Victorina, for that very comprehensive overview of the situation in Ukraine and how at the local level, what are the risks and how this is being addressed. I guess my question to you would be is, how can we bolster or enhance arms control strategies to empower local communities and authorities to work together to address this or to prevent illicit trafficking?
I think we should start with this knowledge awareness and with using a lot of additional tools, like not only law enforcement. We could use capacity building for journalists. We could use capacity building for NGOs. We can use capacity building for local self-governments to understand the risk. And then we have a lot of, for example, in Ukraine, we have a lot of legal instrument of cooperation with police, as I mentioned. We have different local programs. And we could put such activities in this program, but first we need to provide the understanding of risk and threats for all stakeholders and highlight their role in this process. Not only bureaucratic role, not only like a legal role that's provided in particular legislation, but we should highlight them more wide, more broader pictures of this risk.
Thank you for that answer, and thank you for your presentation, and thank you to all three panelists for your presentations. Before moving on to the second video that we have, I want to thank all of you for your interventions, and I think one of the connections that I see with all of these presentations is that to a certain degree, although we are talking about local actions, national and community and regional actions, and of course the overall framework of who is behind this movement, there seems to be a commonality of a message of both having to go back to some of the basic messages that we had to be able to revive this issue and to bring it back to the table so that we are able to address the impact of small arms, both wanting to curb its illicit trafficking, stop diversion, but also address and find ways to prevent and reduce the human costs of these issues. And so I think there is a mix as we go forth of having to return and center our basic knowledge, but to a much wider audience and to stop the silos. And the next video that we will have will feature some speakers that many of you will be very familiar with that will address some of these synergies, not only between the international instruments, but some of the messages and that we have to consider. So I'd ask our colleagues to showcase the next video.
So I think in the last 10 years, we've seen an increase in conflicts. We've seen sort of a crisis of multilateralism. We've seen attacks on norms and rules of international law and human rights law. And I think the instruments that we have to control and regulate the conventional arms trade are needed now more than ever. But these mechanisms are really under attack.
La paz y la seguridad son condiciones básicas para el goce y ejercicio de los derechos humanos. En sociedades en que la violencia viene de la mano con el uso de armas de fuego, estos derechos se ven gravemente limitados. No solo cobran vidas o afectan gravemente la integridad física y psíquica de las personas, sino que impactan en la convivencia de comunidades, en el derecho a gozar de los bienes comunes y de los espacios públicos.
We need the international community to recognize for once and for all the danger that corruption in the defense and security sectors can have on human lives, on sustainable development, and on ensuring peaceful and just societies.
We know that in the world, 91% of people who died through small arms in 2021 were men, and 8% were women. When we know there's been a situation of domestic violence or there's a risk of conflict-related sexual violence, do we have measures that allow us to remove the firearm from a potential perpetrator? One of the important things when we look at small arms control is that we begin to shift a little bit from looking at just the small arm itself to beginning to explore some of the human dimensions to small arms control. Are people trying to acquire weapons to protect their livelihood? That might be an illicit livelihood, but they might not have other options. Are they trying to protect their land because there's been climate change? Are they trying to assert control over other people because of inequalities or because of gender inequality?
Emotions are very important because they directly affect our behaviors and decisions. They are basically a part of our daily life, and they help us know what's wrong from what's right. This is why emotions are a key entry point to understanding why people pick up arms or resort to armed violence in different circumstances.
It has been proven that women, are great agents for bringing peace. There are many research done back in the day on peacekeeping and peace building and the role that many women play during peace negotiations, for instance. And I think that sometimes in our field we don't see that potential, right? And so many of the things that we have as civil society been trying to raise awareness is that it's not only the number of women that we need in the room, it's the role of women, in that room. Are they the ones speaking up? Are they the ones, setting up the agenda? Because that's the meaningful participation of women that we all want. We just don't want the woman to be part of the number.
One thing that I think is necessary is that we harness technology and innovation. And it's innovation around, not only around technology, but also around ideas, and looking at innovative ideas and solutions to overcome many of the problems that we face.
Transparency International's Government Defense Integrity Index allows arms exporters to assess the risk of corruption in the defense institutions of countries they are selling to before they do business with such parties. The index is a resource we continue to expand and develop, contributing towards realizing the sustainable development goals all countries have signed up to.
Our job as a civil society that we need to be engaged more. If we do not do, who will do it, right? So even now it's difficult. Even though there are challenges, we can still do it by, of course, raising awareness, pressurizing the state parties, and convincing the signatory states that you have to come on board. And there's no vested interest but only to save lives by regulating the arms.
We have a lot of work to do, and these agreements are needed now more than ever. Looking for the synergies between these agreements, looking for ways in which we can hold states accountable to fulfill their obligations will be really essential in the coming decade.
Thank you. And with that, we've heard a few additional topics complementing what our panelists have talked about and looking at particularly gender approaches, technologies, synergies, and ideas, and where we're going. And with that full panorama, I would now invite questions and answers. So if you have questions, I'm happy to take them. And I understand there will also be questions from the chat. So I will take them in groups of 2 or 3, and then I'll pass them on to our panelists. Yes, please, go ahead. Perhaps you can just introduce yourself. I think they have the microphone so that they can hear you online.
So, hello everybody. I am Lorenzo Trucco, a recent graduate at the University of Geneva. And my question was, well, first and foremost, thank you for your wonderful insights. And my question was, so given the ability of the demand to basically supply itself with the use of dual-use technologies like 3D printers, I was really curious about what strategies can be used to trace these weapons and increase accountability. And yeah, that's basically my question.
Thank you. I'll move on to this side of the room for Florence in the first and second row. We'll take them in 3s and
Hi everyone, Florence Foster, formerly Quaker United Nations Office Net. Sorry, now a gun for hire, sorry for the pun. Just 3 quick remarks to complement some of the excellent points that were made. And going to the point of sort of the socio-economic impacts that all speakers actually touched upon, I think what's important to note is the decade-long work that OHCHR has been doing on trying to track the impacts of firearms use and acquisitions by civilians of those firearms, focusing in on different either communities or particular rights. A mirror image to that is the reports that they've done on arms transfers. And I think the link has been sort of hinted upon because some of the people in the video spoke to the Arms Trade Treaty, but not really directly nudging on that completely. So I think the links between transfers and acquisitions, I think, is key also to note. And therefore also the responsibilities of states in how they make decisions on arms transfers to note the risks of them being diverted or trafficked. My second point, and that's to the sort of risk analysis and trying to understand how arms-related risks take place in societies. I participated over COVID in a UNIDIR facilitated conversation on this topic that led to guidance being developed. That was published in 2021. It's quite a meaty piece of guidance, so probably needs a little bit more sort of refining to be actually operationalized, but I think that's something worth going back to. So there's sort of points of interest or points to be picked up on there. And then finally, something that wasn't mentioned at all is that these weapons are made by private sector actors. And they also have a responsibility in this game. And ultimately, that is one of the biggest black holes in these conversations often. The UN guiding principles are extremely clear about that. The Working Group on Business and Human Rights issued an information note to that effect, that the arms sector is not free from this responsibility regardless of the licensing process that takes place when arms are transferred. So I think those are sort of remarks. Happy to get any responses from the speakers as they feel like taking those on or ducking them.
Thank you, Florence. Given that those are 2 very, very big questions on dual use issues and transfers and best practices, I wonder if our panelists would like to try to give an answer to those. Victorina, you're also invited to jump in, and I would even say that our colleagues who delivered opening remarks could also be willing to step in if needed. So over to, I don't know who wants to go first.
Neither of us want to go first. You want to go first? You go first. Mark, you go first. Let me just say 2 things then. First, on this question of demand tracing accountability and dual-use technologies, I think we need an economic perspective, basically to raise the costs. And I don't mean that in terms of how much that coat hanger conversion device costs, but rather what are the costs of violating the rules and regulations against possession, of diverting dual-use technologies? Are there appropriate criminal penalties involved? And is there appropriate enforcement of that? And this, of course, it will not eliminate the threat, but it's at least one way to think about changing the balance. And that applies to much of the demand side, in fact, this whole issue of costs. Not going to say anything about diversion or risk analysis, but yes, private sector, there is a small reflection on, in fact, a community of practice on business and conflict, and they're looking at some of the aspects around responsibility for arms firms and how they can be engaged in that. It turns out many of the arms manufacturers themselves are having difficulty raising private capital, for example, because there is a growing understanding among banks and others that maybe this is an investment that has some, shall we say, reputational risks. So there might be some pressure points to find and to push on there. But I encourage anybody who's much more closely attuned to private sector work to try and pursue that.
Just to reply also to the 3D printing question, there needs to be also strengthening the online monitoring, because you find there's a lot of it happening actually online, where you find the models and the patterns that you can just replicate. So it's about this, because the 3D printer itself are used also for other things. This is just part of it. For example, it's used a lot now also in the medical sector to help. So there's this issue, and the costs are lowering of the printer now. So the issue is trying to control through the dark net or even also the white net all these communication going on. And then on the responsibility of the industries and state actors, indeed, I'm not an expert when it comes to the industry, but there's also been a lot of now discussions trying to also integrate these questions, and also trying to go and talk to the industry and see also what is happening and monitoring. There have been also questions of trying to work with the industry on markings as well. There's been these discussions going on markings of firearms, but also of ammunition now. It's coming more and more on the. So there's also these different parts, and there've been also when it comes to transfers and also state actors, there've been also multiple. Research, and it's also ongoing now on gender-based violence, and also on the risk of human rights violation or humanitarian violation. But it's, as we can see nowadays, this is something that really needs to be strengthened and to be also, how can I say, take more prominent space into the discussion.
Thank you for those answers. I'll take two more from the floor, and then I have two from here. I have the lady with the beautiful blue and yellow scarf here in the third row.
Thank you so much, Lily Hunzimana with the Baha'i International Community. I wanted to pick up on a few threads that were mentioned earlier regarding the role of women as peacemakers and peace builders, especially given that in 2025 will be the 25th anniversary of Resolution 1325. And then a few things, I was really happy to hear the Pact for the Future being mentioned, but also the new Agenda for Peace. So, within the Pact, there is a call for the Secretary General to write a report on the increasing militarization and how that gets in the way of the realizing the SDGs, and that has to be delivered within the next UNGA session. And of course, there's also an opportunity to review the Pact, I think, by the 83rd session of the GA. So given these kind of points in time, I wonder if you see opportunities to be able to raise the small arms agenda across these time points, because I think one of the speakers mentioned that this is an agenda that's maybe on life support. So it'd be interesting to hear how we can bring that more to the international attention, and what opportunities do you foresee in across these different points.
Thank you. And while we wait to give the floor, I see there are hands at the back here. Can't see. Yes, at the very back with the white jacket. But as we wait for this question, maybe I can ask this one, which we've come from the chat. We're being asked if there are specific studies about the link between illicit arms trafficking and small arms issues and terrorism. This is one of the questions that we have. So in addition to the ones on the role of women that we've just heard. And then we'll go for the one from the floor. In the last row, I'm sorry, can't see exactly who it is. Yes, with the white jacket, yes.
Yes. Hello, my name is Kaya Vanderhorst. I'm with the Quaker United Nations office. Thank you all for your excellent presentations. I have two questions, and the first relates to the fact that despite Mexico's historic case of transnational litigation against U.S. gun manufacturers that's now been taken to the Supreme Court, there's still a lack of recognition on the role of the U.S. gun industry and lax U.S. gun laws that they play in exacerbating firearm-related violence and deaths in the entire region. And so based on this, I was wondering where you all think that that litigation plays, what role litigation plays in the future of small arms control, holding private industry accountable, which builds off an earlier comment made. And the second question is, what role do you see cities playing in the future of small arms control, considering that, as I believe it was Ms. Veronina pointed out, that armed violence is not only a problem of control, but also a problem of culture, and as the video pointed out, multiple factors play in the allure of the acquisition of a firearm. So based on that, to what extent do you see cities as new global governance actors that bring value to international discussions on the implementation of existing instruments and possible developments of new ones? Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe I'd give the panelists a chance to respond to those questions. Victorina, I don't know if you want to jump in, particularly on this last question. I don't know if you're still with us. I can't see you on the screen, but is she still with us? No? Okay, well, maybe I'll turn to the panelists here. Anne-Séverine, are there any of those three daunting questions that you would like to tackle?
The question on the link between arms trafficking and terrorism. So there have been a couple of research and publications on preventing violent extremism and also the links with trafficking. So we've had also at the survey a publication on this. I believe this was published in 2021 or 2022. But if you use on our website the keywords terrorism or violent extremism, you will find it. There have been also other organizations working on that. I believe also UNIDIR and other that. But we can definitely, if you send us an email, we can definitely share with you the different research that we are aware of. Regarding the litigation and accountability, so this is something that we've been also monitoring. We're gonna see where this goes. We know that there have been also CARICOM impacts, or some of the states within CARICOM impacts have also backed this litigation. So this is not sure how this will go, but this is something that we're looking at, and that we're waiting on the results. But this is. This might also bring a precedent to future other such endeavors.
On the cities point, I think there's been a lot of work in American cities in particular on violence prevention reduction. Some of those lessons are transferable, some of them are not, in part because the levels of violence in many American cities are very different than in other places. But I wouldn't think it has to go up to the international discussions. I think this could be much more cobweb-based through city partnerships, through creating, and I mentioned armed violence observatories, which is one tool. There's also living labs. I think Montreal has one that brings together all of the stakeholders on these kinds of issues, because it had a resurgence of armed violence, mostly gun-related, but not exclusively, in certain parts of Montreal. And these innovative solutions can be transported transversely. They don't have to go up to some kind of multilateral forum. And I think that's a way forward. On Mexico, on the legal side, I think you addressed that. Mexico, we need to be just a little careful. When you look at the arms that are being used by the drug trafficking organizations, Some of them are extraordinarily high-powered military-style weapons that are not coming across the border from the United States, but are coming from somewhere else, in particular potentially Mexican stocks, although there's no evidence publicly available on that. So the problem is also within. This is not to let the American gun manufacturers and the straw purchasers off the hook, but we need to have a really good understanding of what exactly is fueling the violence in these kind of contexts.
Thank you, Keith. Victoria, would you like to jump in on some of these questions? And I know we haven't answered the questions on the role of women in the 1325 also. Go ahead.
You know, now in Ukraine, we are on like a starting point of understanding the problem. We still do not have appropriate legislation on firearms possession. We still do not any appropriate law on other types of small arms and light weapons. We still need to be associated with EU and implement its requirement of EU association agreement. And in parallel, our civilians right now is under process of understanding the risk and threats. And actually, we need to find a way and find the best practices to use in Ukraine, how to deal with this risk, how to deal with this problem. Now we see some risks, but we still need to make additional researches. We still need to communicate with other stakeholders. And we need, I think, it's a typical, but we need the whole government approach to deal with the problem and not put it on the shoulders only for our law enforcement agencies. So actually, I think our country is open for any best practices, any lessons learned from different contexts, different post-armed conflict environment, what to do with actually with such risk, and engage as much stakeholders in this process as possible.
Thank you, Victoria. And without forgetting the question that we had on women and gender, I have another question here that's come from the chat asking us how we can strengthen the links between small arms control and disarmament and security sector reform when we're looking at law enforcement. So those would be the two questions that I would put back to the three panelists. I don't know who wants to start first.
My turn. I don't think we were trying to duck the gender question. I think that was actually also a comment in that sense. And I think Callum on the video touched upon that fairly well. I mean, it's something that has now been integrated entirely into all of the programs and studies, whereas previously, I think we would all agree, it was treated as like a separate issue. So I think that that's one part of it. I think we ought to be cautious about what kind of achievements have come out of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Those people from within who have studied it are, shall we say, skeptical about how effective it's been in really moving the dial on women's engagement in the whole range of peace activities, not just those related to small arms, which it is in the Pact for the Future. The language is relatively weak about, we'll reinforce our efforts, et cetera, and that creates an opening, but it also implies that the commitment is relatively weak among many of the key stakeholders. Finally, Mark and others can speak to this, but there's not, follow the money. There's not a lot of investment in dealing with the gender dimension of this, and I think you need to point to the donors as well and say, if this is an issue that concerns you, if you have a feminist foreign policy, whatever that might mean in your country, then put your money where your policy is to actually take some concrete actions on this, and that's something that's been lacking. I'll leave the SSR question to other people, including Mark, who worked on that for like a long time.
I'll try with the link between small arms control and SSR. So there's also been a kind of attempt to also reconciliate those parts within the security and defense sectors, because sometimes small arms control per se and SSR were looked at not being something that could be how can I say, the work used to be a bit in silos. So now there's this attempt to trying to reconciliate and merge more and see the importance also of small arms control within SSR.
Thank you. I see that our colleagues from the Swiss Federation would like to take the floor. Mr. Cerruti, you have the floor, and then I'll take one more question from the floor, and we will wrap it up.
Thank you very much. Just to react on a couple of questions that were mentioned before. Just on the first one, I think by the colleague there who was asking about new technological development, to which Keith started answering. We don't have a clear answer yet to what we can do, and to in this regard, in June this year, there was an open-ended technical expert group that was created that will look exactly into that matter in terms of how we can address those new technological development that we don't know yet how to trace and react to. So that's one thing that the international community will look into. On private sector and the responsibility, it is indeed a tricky question. We were in the negotiation for the global framework on ammunition. There's such a variety of views between states that it's hard to find a high common denominator. What we did in Switzerland is we also engaged with our ammunition manufacturer to look into what practices they had, what level of markings they have. So I think also governments can, if there's no possibility to have really a strong multilateral agreement on something, governments can at least have national dialogues with their private sector to look at maybe voluntary frameworks, or at least to try to strengthen that. And on WPS, I don't have a direct answer to your question, but I'll use your question to do some advertisement. Next week at the UN Security Council, so Switzerland has the presidency of the council this month, and next week we'll have a high-level event chaired by our president, Viola Amherd, that will be exactly on WPS and the role of women in mediation processes. So if you're interested, you can tune on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cerruti. I think Mark is asking for the floor also.
Hi, just 2 quick points. I think the issue on new technologies, obviously there's this dual use, conundrum that we have, whether it's 3D printers or whether it's commercial drones. And here, this isn't only something that the small arms community can resolve itself. It's an issue, I think, of a discussion between trade. So how do you limit access to or control access to without undermining the kind of economic use that these dual-use technology can have, and so there's no answer at the moment. There's some interesting, I think, also technological developments on how to trace certain aspects of, 3D printer outputs, etc. And that's the key challenge. Obviously, with the point I think a lot of us have made here today is that non-industrially produced weapons, ammunition, or explosives are almost on a par to industrially produced weapons, and they have markings, but the 3D printed weapons, etc., don't. And so this is an ongoing discussion, and it's a key challenge for the future. And this is where progress, I think, has been made with the UN POA setting up this open-ended expert group. But there is a gap, I think, in international frameworks when it comes to the issue of improvised weapons, improvised ammunition, and improvised explosives. Maybe just on the SSR, I think I probably should have a go at answering this. There is a kind of Venn diagram between SSR and small arms control and armed violence. When you're talking about reform of the security sector, one of it is obviously looking at the capacities that are required to be able to provide both effective and accountable security. And when you look at, the data, the impact on communities and individuals in terms of armed violence is high. And so, for example, we're involved with the EU and the League of Arab States, and we work very closely with Interpol and World Customs Organization, where we as an organization focus on weapons and ammunition management, so to prevent the diversion from state stockpiles. Interpol works with security actors on investigations and interdictions of the illicit supply, and World Customs Organization obviously works with customs organizations, and the 3 organizations working together, I think, are able to focus on and develop a more integrated approach to arms control at national level, working with security actors but also policymakers.
Thank you, Mark, for that. Do we have time for one more question? Yes. The lady with the brown scarf here in the corner. I don't know where the microphone is, just in the fourth row, I believe, at the back. And that will be our last question, and then we will wrap up so that we don't get in trouble with time managers.
Thank you very much. Francesca Grandi from Transparency International. I work in the global program of transparency that works to show the corruption in the defense and security sector and its direct effects on armed proliferation is actually a major force driving violence and armed conflict. And therefore, that has very real consequences on the life and safety of communities. And I was very pleased to hear from the panelists that we really need to bring the victims into the conversation. So my question is, if you could think of any example of localized and gender-responsive approaches that have been successful in using anti-corruption measures as an effective conflict prevention tool. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't know who wants to try to tackle that. Keith?
No. But maybe the people inside the survey could come up with something.
I do not know as well. So, yeah, I don't know.
Maybe we could take that as a suggestion for something that should be looked at.
Absolutely. I think that there is room for that to be further explored, and particularly as it connects to even security sector reform, because this is corruption can be built into these issues, and looking at gender responsiveness as a whole. But first and foremost, I want to thank everyone for your participation this afternoon or this morning afternoon in this important session and panel. And of course, my three panelists, Keith, Anne-Séverine, and Victoria, for your wonderful contributions this morning to this conversation, and really highlighting at three different levels how small arms issues have evolved over the last few years, and what are the priorities and where we're going. And I think that despite everything that is going on in the world, and despite the fact that 25 years into this issue, we are still having to tackle some very major basic elements of illicit arms trafficking prevention of diversion. We have come a long way, and we are able to have this conversation because of the work that we've been able to do. I think we can very clearly see that we have a much more sophisticated international framework, multilateral framework to address the issue. Our national and regional capacities have been strengthened. We see regional work plans and maps that are coming together, asking colleagues to look at the issue of small arms control and the prevention of illicit trafficking and diversion from a much more holistic and wider-based approach, bringing in a lot of the cross-cutting issues that we've discussed here today, whether it's corruption or gender prevention or empowering of women in these issues, bringing on board public health, looking at this issue from an angle that is much wider than simply a defense or security issue, I think showcases the evolution that we've had on this topic. And I believe that the new tools that we have, such as the Pact of the Future, such as the new Agenda for Peace, also give us room to go back to some of the origins of this movement, which is to really put human security, human-centered approaches at the forefront of any decision and policies and research and data collection that we do as we move forth and try to continue to tackle these issues in a collective and collaborative way. So thank you to my three panelists, and thank you for all of you for attending today, both online and here in person. And I hope you have a wonderful end of week of the Geneva Peace Week, and we look forward to hearing from all of you. And let's keep working on this. There's still a lot to be done. Thank you, and thank you to the organizers for allowing me.